develops at an early age is there's a process that neuroscientists have called pruning, which literally means that 60% of the neural circuits have been pruned, are being pruned away from birth right through adolescence, actually early adulthood. So we always hear about this term, use it or lose it, for the older brain. It may be even more pertinent for a very young brain. Now, what does all this have to do with brain evolution? We know that as we have evolved to become a more advanced species, that our brains have gotten bigger. This is a well-known observation. And we also know that there have been major milestones or breakthroughs in brain evolution. For example, the development of the handheld tool. What happened that one of our ancestors, or several of them, figured out, well, I can take a rock and I can shave it, turn it into a tool. And to do that, that involved complex reasoning. And so the prefrontal cortex, the front part of the brain, enlarged relatively rapidly in terms of evolutionary time. And there was coevolution of other developments. For example, grammatical language developed, more complex social networks, all in a very, very short period in terms of evolution. Now, my question to you is, what will happen with the advent or development of this handheld tool? How will that affect brain evolution? And one way to understand that is look at what Charles Darwin taught us about natural selection. Basically, that genetic variants that adapt best to the environment, those are the ones that are most likely to survive. This explains the tremendous diversity that we see among the species. This was the environment our brains adapted to hundreds of thousands of years ago. Here's the new environment. So the question is, how will that affect brain evolution? So this is one artist's idea. It will turn it upside down. And that's actually a pretty old computer there, and probably this person has really big thumbs from texting constantly. Now, so some of you are thinking, well, look, when I was a kid, my grandmother told me that television would rot my brain, and really, is this thesis really makes sense? Well, let's look at it in a little more detail. And one issue is how much time young people are spending with their technology. And the answer to that question comes to us from the Kaiser Family Foundation. They've been studying this for a number of years. And just by a show of hands, you may have been following this in the media, so you may know the answer. But they've looked at 8 to 18-year-olds, and they add up all the technology time that they have. So how many of you think it's 4 hours a day? Okay. How many feel it's 6 hours a day? We should see the bell-shaped curve coming. How about 8 hours? That was probably right a few years ago, but now the correct answer is 11 and a half hours a day. And that also includes multitasking quite a bit, because usually they're involved with several technologies at once. So this defines this new generation of digital natives. They're born into the technology. They're using it 24/7. Their brains are wired to become quite effective in manipulating the technology, and that's marvelous. The downside is that they're not spending time with human contact, face-to-face skills. So you have a conversation, they don't look you in the eye, they don't notice nonverbal cues. Not long ago, my 17-year-old Rachel, I said to her, Rachel, when I'm talking to you and you're texting at the same time, I just don't get the sense that you're listening. And so she looked up from her texting and said, don't worry, Dad, I don't do this with my teachers, and then went right back down. So, the technology, it's very seductive. We love it. It's very hard for us to stop using it. And I think that's especially true for these younger digital natives. And it brings up the question of technology addiction. And there's some debate about this. I don't know that the psychiatrists believe that there is such an addiction, but certainly in Asia, they believe that it's there. They actually have special rehab centers for teenagers who they feel are addicted to some of these video games. And I think that there is an addiction. If you look at the dopamine circuits in the brain, the reward centers that really can kind of get triggered. And it can take many forms. It depends on the content. It can be shopping, eBay. It can be gambling. So you don't have to come to Vegas to gamble. It's right there anywhere. It can be virtual games like Second Life. People play these 12, 14 hours a game. They have a better version of themselves on the computer, and it's very hard for them to stop playing. Now, why do people get addicted? And even in this room, probably most of us will say, well, I'm not addicted. I can quit any time, right? I've gotten phone calls from people frantic. Oh my God, the server's down in the hotel. How do I do things? You know, and they have a little withdrawal. But let's say we're not addicted. But think about probably your experience with email, and probably many of us use it. And why is email so hard for us to stop using? You get that little ping or that little vibrate, and oh, you want to check it. Well, I think one of the reasons is that it follows operant conditioning, which is basically a principle that tells us the consequence of a behavior will reinforce that behavior. So here's what I mean. So let's let this sad face represent the content or our response to a typical email. It's usually boring, or it's work, or it's repetitive, or it's spam. When we open up another one, and again, it's an annoying email, and here's another one, and we're all ready to give up with email, and then we get one of these. And then we think, oh yeah, that's great. I opened this up and the letter to the editor was accepted, and now I'm feeling good, I'm pumped, and so I go back to my email and I keep checking and checking and checking. So that kind of pattern is much more reinforcing than if every email was a happy face. And because if you think about it, probably many of us took a shower this morning and we probably didn't notice how good it felt to get in a nice hot shower. But if you go camping for 5 days and you get in a shower, then you notice it. So it's that operant conditioning. Now, what about this idea that perhaps the technology is interfering with face-to-face communication skills? A study not long ago involved nearly 200 students ranging in age from 17 to 23. And they asked the participants to look at a neutral face morph into either an angry face or a happy face. And they found that when the students played a violent video game, it slowed down their response. So it took them longer to recognize the happy face. And so we have that kind of data supporting the observations many of us have seen with the computer interfering with face-to-face communication. There's also some debate about technology maybe worsening attention. And there's an association between spending more time watching TV, using videos, and having worse symptoms of ADHD or attention deficit. There's debate because the cause and effect relationship has not actually been proven. But there's enough concern that the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends no technology for very young children. And so we have the fractured family, and we have the older digital immigrants reading a newspaper or a book, and younger people reading online, although that's changing to some extent because ebooks seem to be adapted by the older generation for a number of reasons we can talk about later. So the digital immigrants, they learn the technology later in life, they have better face-to-face skills, but they're trying to get at the technology at a time when their brains have changed to some extent. The reaction time is slower, their memories may be challenged, and they're definitely slower to embrace the new technology. So this was something cute I saw where you have kind of a little phone with a dial on it, And it's still part of our language. We say, I'll dial that number. Whenever I say that, I feel odd because we don't dial anymore. So to get a sense of how the how many of us here think they are digital immigrants? Okay, people are slow to hold their hands up. Okay, so how many of you are too busy checking your email to raise your hand? Okay. So here's an idea to give you an idea of the pace of innovation for this older generation. I can remember the first time I watched color television. That was a huge breakthrough. And then we could erase on a typewriter. That was amazing. And I remember cutting and pasting, really cutting and pasting on the early phones. And then we finally got mobile phones, and then video games. And of course, now the pace is just amazing. And we're at this incredible conference where everything is so new and so quick. And yet, the older generation still is less rapid. This is a study from a few years ago. I don't think it applies today, but at that time, about only 33% of people who are 75 or older were using computers. I think it's a little bit higher right now, but still you see this age effect in terms of technology adaption. And I know later in some of the panels, there'll be some discussion about why people are not taking on these technologies. Now, I mentioned that one of the challenges is the brain is getting older, and there's memory challenges. These are some studies that we did with the PET scan probe that we developed at